The year was 1944, and the Pacific had turned into a vast archipelago of desperation. From the Marianas to the Philippines, from Iwo Jima to Okinawa, American forces pressed forward, island by island, into what the Imperial Japanese command called the Absolute Defense Line. Behind them, in caves, ravines, and thick jungles, the remnants of the Imperial Army and Navy cut off, starved and terrified lingered long after battlefields fell silent. Psychological warfare had become a new weapon. According to the U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Branch, 1945 reports, over 60 million leaflets were printed in the Pacific Theater during the final years of the war. Some were crude exhortations, others finely printed documents bearing the imperial seal. Many promised safety and fair treatment to any Japanese soldier who surrendered, but for most of those men, the idea of surrender was beyond comprehension. The Imperial Rescript of 1941, issued under the name of the Emperor, had made it clear dying for the Emperor was an honor, surrender a stain. In training camps across Kyushu and Honshu, officers drilled this into young minds with ritual intensity. By 1944, the indoctrination was so complete that even hunger could not dislodge it. On Saipan, when the U.S. Army's 27th Infantry Division began broadcasting surrender appeals, leaflets fluttered over cliffs where hundreds of Japanese civilians had taken refuge. Survivors later testified to Allied investigators that the papers were seen as traps, American tricks designed to lure the weak. Yet, when the food ran out and the cries of children echoed against volcanic rock, a few emerged waving the leaflets. Some were shot by their own soldiers as traitors. The Japanese Imperial Headquarters Censorship Office, in its final pre-surrender bulletin of July 1945, admitted that enemy propaganda has spread panic among non-combatants, but commanders were instructed to continue resistance to the last man. The contradiction was lethal. When American troops landed on Guam, the same patterns repeated. Leaflets drifted down like gray snow, drawings of smiling Japanese soldiers being fed by American guards, kanji messages assuring humane treatment under the Geneva Convention. U.S. units often dropped them in bundles, weighted with sand, over known cave systems. Inside those caves, however, men in tattered uniforms laughed bitterly. "Yankee lies," one survivor later recalled to the Asahi Shimbun in 1951. "They wrote that rice and water awaited us, but we believed the Emperor still fought." The caves became tombs. On Guam, in the hills near Mount Mataguac, isolated groups continued to live underground for years. The last known holdouts there did not emerge until 1960, 15 years after the war's end. But in 1944, when the leaflets first fell, their faith was unbroken. By early 1945, the U.S. Office of War Information had refined its methods. Leaflets were now tailored to regions and dialects, carrying credible signatures and sometimes bearing photographs of Emperor Hirohito himself, images never seen by most Japanese soldiers, as the emperor's face had been sacred and hidden. According to OWI Psychological Warfare Bulletin No. 78, February 1945, the inclusion of the emperor's likeness was meant to suggest authenticity and authority. It worked only rarely. On Iwo Jima, where the volcanic ash swallowed men and machines alike, 21,000 Japanese defenders prepared to die rather than yield. When the first surrender leaflets landed, embedded in the sand or caught in the wire, few dared even to pick them up. Possession of one could be deemed treason. In several accounts recorded by the U.S. Marine Corps Historical Division, 1946, captured prisoners said their comrades burned the leaflets at night, fearing divine retribution if they read them. Yet hunger gnawed at discipline. The American bombardment had turned the island's few water sources into sulphurous pools. For weeks, survivors licked condensation from cave walls. When they found a leaflet describing the proper surrender procedure, hands raised, white cloth in hand, moved toward American lines, they remembered it. When finally captured, those few who obeyed it credited the paper for their survival. Farther south, on Okinawa, the story took a darker turn. Civilian suicides, driven by rumors of American atrocities, reached the tens of thousands. Leaflets promising mercy drifted into this chaos. The U.S. Tenth Army Propaganda Unit's field diary, June 1945, described baskets of printed matter dropped by airburst shell to reach caves occupied by Japanese troops and civilians. The diary noted with grim understatement that response negligible. The caves became echo chambers of fear where parents killed their children rather than risk capture. In the final days before Japan's surrender, American aircraft dropped a different kind of leaflet, the atomic bomb warning of August 6–9, 1945. These bore warnings of devastation and urged evacuation of major cities. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki burned, their credibility was no longer questioned, but by then most of the soldiers who needed to see them were already isolated on islands beyond reach of any command. When Emperor Hirohito broadcast the surrender on August 15, 1945, the dual voice broadcast, few holdouts heard it. Radios were rare, and the speech was delivered in archaic Japanese that even civilians struggled to understand. In the jungles and caves of the Philippines, the Marianas, and the Dutch East Indies, silence meant continuation. The war, for them, had not ended. In the months that followed, the U.S. Psychological Warfare Division intensified leaflet operations, this time not as propaganda, but as notification of reality. Each carried the Imperial seal, a facsimile of the surrender text, and an assurance of the Emperor's command. Cease resistance and come out peacefully. Thousands fluttered through tropical air, settling on palm leaves and coral beaches. Some were carried by wind into caves where skeletal soldiers clung to their rifles, but habit and fear were stronger than paper. The first to surrender were often dismissed by others as impostors. When the American forces sent captured soldiers back with loudspeakers, their pleas were answered with gunfire. As the U.S. Sixth Army Civil Affairs Report, 1946, recorded, leaflets, broadcasts, and personal appeals proved effective only when starvation reached irreversible levels. In the forests of northern Luzon, small groups of Japanese troops continued to believe that the Emperor's surrender was enemy deceit. Years passed. Leaflets changed, designs modernized, but the message remained the same. The jungle absorbed them all, paper dissolving into soil, ink into rain. By 1949, the Allied occupation of Japan was ending, but the Pacific still whispered with ghosts. From Guam came rumors of men seen moving at night. From the Philippines, villagers spoke of strangers stealing rice. Each time, the U.S. and later the Japanese government responded with new operations. Leaflet drops, recorded messages, emissaries. The men still hiding students, farmers, conscripts, laughed when they saw the papers. They had been told the Americans would enslave them, that Japan's mainland had been invaded, that surrender was impossible. Hunger was their only truth. The war had officially ended, but across the scattered islands of the western Pacific, the silence was deceptive. Patrols still moved through the brush. Villagers still whispered of rustling at night. The United States had shifted from invasion to occupation, yet its psychological operations branch remained active, now joined by Japanese officials under Allied supervision. Their mission was no longer conquest, but recovery, finding their own lost sons. In early 1946, the U.S. Army Civil Affairs Division created a subunit in Manila tasked with repacification of residual Japanese personnel. According to the Civil Affairs Annual Report 1946, its primary tools were leaflets, radio appeals, and organized surrender teams composed of Japanese prisoners of war. The first operation targeted northern Luzon, where intelligence suggested several hundred Japanese still occupied the Cordillera Highlands. Leaflets again became the currency of hope and suspicion. These were not the rough wartime prints of 1944. They bore photographs of families stamped with the red chrysanthemum of the Imperial seal and signed by General Douglas MacArthur himself. One version, catalogued as Leaflet Series 3003A, carried a short message from Emperor Hirohito confirming that the war has ended and the empire calls its loyal subjects home. To the men in the mountains, this was absurd. They had lived through too many American tricks. According to interrogations preserved in the National Archives of Japan, Holdout Files, number 17, captured soldiers said they had assumed the emperor had been forced to write those words under duress. The cycle of disbelief repeated on island after island. On Mindoro, Philippine scouts found a group of 11 Japanese in 1947 half-starved, armed with rusted rifles. They had surrendered after a typhoon destroyed their food cache. One of them carried a fragment of a 1946 leaflet in a bamboo tube, wrapped carefully against moisture. "We waited for proof," he told American interrogators, but proof never came. By 1948, the U.S. military had largely withdrawn, and the task of locating the holdouts fell to the new Japanese Ministry of Repatriation. Its officers, often veterans themselves, approached the mission with a mixture of bureaucratic precision and quiet guilt. They combed through old rosters, ship manifests, and unit diaries. Each missing name was a possible ghost somewhere in the Pacific. In 1949, on the island of Anatahan in the Marianas, a U.S. Navy reconnaissance plane spotted cultivated gardens and laundry hanging among the palms. Over the next 2 years, repeated leaflet drops and loudspeaker broadcasts identified the inhabitants as 31 Japanese survivors from the Saipan campaign. They had created a small secret colony, led by a former sailor named Sakamoto. According to U.S. Navy Intelligence Report 12-51, the leaflets included personal letters from their families and photographs supplied by Japanese newspapers. The group ignored them all, convinced the Americans had fabricated everything. It was only in 1951, 6 years after the war, that the Anatahan group finally emerged. Hunger and malaria had thinned their ranks to 20. They carried the old leaflets with them as if they were relics, still unreadable symbols of doubt. Their story, printed in the Yomiuri Shimbun that June, shocked post-war Japan. The public realized that the war had not ended cleanly. It had simply retreated into the jungle. Elsewhere, the same pattern unfolded. On Guam, 2 soldiers were captured in 1950 after a brief skirmish with local police. One, Sergeant Shoichi Mikoshiba, stated in his debriefing that he had seen hundreds of leaflets over the years. "They fell like butterflies," he said, but he assumed each one a trap until American patrols surrounded him. The slow revelation of these stragglers fascinated the press and horrified officials. The Japanese government began coordinating with the U.S. Air Force to produce updated surrender notices printed on waterproof rice paper, durable enough to survive monsoon rain. These were distributed across Micronesia, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies between 1951 and 1953. The most persistent cases came from the Philippine jungles. In 1952, reports reached Tokyo that several dozen Japanese soldiers were still living in the Sierra Madre Mountains under a Captain Fumio Nakayama. Leaflets were dropped bearing his name and the seal of the 31st Army. It took another year before Philippine scouts recovered evidence of their camp bamboo shelters, improvised weapons, a small altar where faded leaflets were nailed like charms against evil. According to the Philippine Constabulary Archive, Case File number 77A, when search teams played recorded messages from former comrades, the hidden soldiers responded by beating drums and shouting battle cries. They still believed reinforcements would come from the mainland. At home, Japan was rebuilding, its cities glowing with neon and industry, but the government continued to fund search missions. Each rediscovered holdout was treated not as a criminal, but as a remnant of national tragedy. Newspapers called them living fossils of the Showa War. The paradox was painful. Men who had rejected surrender were now symbols of peace, precisely because they had outlasted it. In 1953, the Japanese Defense Agency, predecessor Files Series 1, noted that approximately 100 to 150 persons remain unaccounted for in the Pacific, presumed alive. Most were believed to be in the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, or small islands near New Guinea. It would take 2 more decades to find the last of them. The leaflets had changed again. Gone were the official seals and military phrasing. In their place appeared letters from mothers, former classmates, even local mayors. The language softened. "Come home. Your country is at peace." Air crews sometimes added photographs of contemporary Tokyo streets buses, women in Western dress, neon signs to show how much had changed. The idea was simple: make the modern world undeniable. But to the holdouts, the world had ended in 1945. The passage of time itself became another American deception. By 1954, the last confirmed group on Mindoro surrendered, led by Lieutenant Ito. They emerged waving a white flag improvised from an old leaflet stitched into a cloth. To reporters, Ito said he had finally believed because the paper smelled of Japan. The ink and fiber were domestic, unmistakably homemade. It was the first time the psychological warfare branch had outsourced printing to Tokyo rather than Guam. Still, others waited. By 1954, the Allied occupation had ended, yet in scattered jungles, the war's shadow still lived. Japan's new self-defense agency worked with the U.S. Air Force on a joint program titled Operation Reunion. According to the agency's 1955 annual log, its goal was to locate remaining Imperial personnel and repatriate them through non-combat means. That phrase, non-combat, masked the haunting truth that some men had been fighting ghosts for 10 years. The Philippines became the center of the search. Reports from farmers and hunters spoke of gunfire deep in the Sierra Madre and Mindoro Mountains. Every sighting revived the ritual. New leaflets printed, new recordings made, planes sent to circle the canopy. The U.S. Air Weather Service's reconnaissance report 3-56 notes that 3.2 million leaflets were dropped over northern Luzon alone that year. They bore photographs of Emperor Hirohito in Western suit, standing beside Prime Minister Yoshida. The caption read, "The Empire prospers in peace. Return." One of those leaflets fell through the leaves onto the cap of a young lieutenant named Hiroo Onoda. He had been trained by the Imperial Army's Nakano School in intelligence and guerrilla warfare. His orders, issued on Lubang Island in December 1944, were explicit. No surrender, no suicide, continue harassing the enemy until reinforcements arrived. When the war ended, he was 23. When the first leaflets reached him, he was 24, and he laughed. According to the Japanese Foreign Ministry's Lubang archive, entry number 12, the first post-war leaflets he encountered were dated October 1945 and bore the Imperial signature. He judged the typography clumsy, the paper too thin. "They were forgeries," he later told interviewers in 1974, so he burned them. For decades, he and 3 comrades lived by night, stealing rice and bananas from local fields, killing cattle when necessary. Each time the Air Force dropped leaflets, he and his men examined them like archaeologists, studying relics from a future age. The dates advanced: 1950, 1952, 1959. Yet they insisted the Americans were printing false calendars. When they found a newspaper fragment in 1960 showing the Olympic construction in Tokyo, they called it propaganda art. By 1962, only Onoda and 1 other survived. The Philippine police had long since stopped treating the incidents as military. Now they were crimes. Villagers feared the forest bandits who raided for food. Still, the search continued. According to the Japanese Embassy Manila Dispatch, number 1463, teams dropped leaflets bearing his family's photographs and letters written in childhood handwriting. They floated down like messages from another world, unanswered. On another island, Guam, a different ghost still hid. Sergeant Shoichi Yokoi had burrowed into a tunnel along the Talofofo River. For 28 years he lived in darkness, catching shrimp and rats, weaving cloth from tree fiber. Leaflets had reached him too. His burrow was found lined with them, layered like sediment. When he was discovered by local hunters in January 1972, he was gaunt and trembling. "I am ashamed," he told interviewers later, "but I obeyed my orders to the end." Yokoi's capture ignited a wave of both national mourning and fascination. Television broadcast his return to Tokyo. Crowds lined the streets with tears and flags. In the background, the psychological operations staff quietly re-examined their archives. Thousands of leaflets had failed to convince one man in a hole. What, then, was the measure of words against belief? Yet the greatest holdout was still at large. On Lubang, Onoda continued his private war through the 1960s. He had become a legend among Philippine farmers and a symbol of embarrassment for Tokyo. In 1965, a former comrade named Akatsu had surrendered and was flown back to the island to call to him through loudspeakers. The recording, preserved in the Philippine Defense Sound Archive tape B-17, ends with the crackle of gunfire. Onoda had shot at the helicopter. By 1974, the search shifted to a younger generation. An adventurous Japanese student named Norio Suzuki told friends he would go to find Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman in that order. He found Onoda first. Deep in the forest, he met a gaunt man in faded uniform and spoke gently of the Emperor, of television, of cars that ran on gasoline, not horses. Onoda listened but refused to believe until his former commander, Major Taniguchi, was flown in from Japan. Taniguchi read aloud the formal order to cease operations dated 1945. Only then did Onoda salute and surrender. His rifle was still oiled, his sword sharp, his uniform patched from leaflets stitched together into cloth. The paper he had once mocked had become his armor. When news reached Tokyo, millions watched in astonishment. The government issued a statement of gratitude to the Philippine authorities for their patience and declared Onoda a symbol of discipline and devotion to duty carried beyond all human limits. But beneath the ceremony lingered the quiet irony that paper, cheap, fragile, born on the wind, had finally won the war decades after the guns fell silent. When Hiroo Onoda stepped out of the jungle in March 1974, the war that had defined his life was already a memory in textbooks. The Pacific Islands, where he had fought, were now tourist resorts. Children played on beaches once scarred by artillery. But his surrender revived an entire generation's memories, the echo of fanatical endurance, of faith that outlasted nations. In Tokyo, newspapers filled their front pages with photographs of the gaunt lieutenant saluting the rising sun. Commentators debated whether he was a hero or a relic. In Manila, villagers remembered the dead cattle, the burned fields, the decades of fear. To the Philippine Constabulary Records Division, March 1974 report, Onoda's case closed an era that had lasted 29 years beyond its end. Still, the jungle was not silent yet. Another group remained somewhere among the Palau Islands, two men believed to be former Imperial Navy sailors. Leaflets had been dropped there since the late 1940s, occasionally rediscovered by fishermen who used them as tinder. In 1974, the Japanese government, encouraged by Onoda's case, launched one final wave of appeals. According to Foreign Ministry Circular No. 1974, aircraft from the Japan Air Self-Defense Force released new leaflets written in soft civilian language. "The war ended long ago. Your families await you. Come home." 1 year later, in 1975, two men, Private Matsudo Linsoki and Corporal Nakamura Teruo, walked out of the forest of Morotai, skeletal and nearly mute. They carried a pouch containing damp fragments of the leaflets. For months they had debated whether the papers were real. When they finally stepped into the open, villagers fed them rice and called the authorities. The Japanese Defense Agency Repatriation Report, December 1975, recorded them as the last confirmed soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army to surrender. Nakamura, born in Taiwan, returned to a homeland that no longer recognized his citizenship. He died quietly in 1979. His story, like Onoda's and Yokoi's, became part of Japan's uneasy reflection on the war. What belief could make men refuse peace? After 1975, the Great Leaflet Campaign was over. Warehouses once filled with propaganda paper were emptied. The U.S. Department of Defense Historical Review, 1976, called it the longest psychological warfare operation in modern history. From 1944 to 1974, nearly 100 million leaflets had been printed and scattered across the Pacific. Most dissolved in rain. Some survived as keepsakes in museums, the ink faded, the words still pleading for surrender. Yet their legacy was larger than their failure or success. In Japan, educators and filmmakers began to revisit the idea of communication as weapon and salvation. The image of the leaflet fluttering through jungle air, unread, misunderstood, became a symbol of the post-war generation's struggle to reach its own past. Students debated the ethics of obedience, the cost of faith, and the power of printed words to end or prolong violence. Documentary crews traveled to Guam, Lubang, and Morotai to film the caves where men had hidden for decades. They found shrines made of shell casings, water jugs carved from bombs, and paper fragments preserved under stones. Some were prayers written on the backs of surrender leaflets, half spiritual, half desperate. One such fragment, displayed in the Yasukuni War Museum's 1981 exhibition, Echoes of the Pacific, bore a simple inscription in brush strokes: "If this is peace, let it find me." The handwriting was never identified. In both Japan and the United States, historians came to see the leaflet campaign not merely as propaganda, but as the first mass experiment in psychological outreach. The U.S. Psychological Operations Compendium, 1982, described it as a dialogue with the isolated a conversation conducted through silence, paper, and wind. Its authors noted that, in the end, surrender came not from persuasion, but from hunger, fatigue, and time. Still, hunger was not only physical. The hungry students of later decades, those who had grown up among ruins and rebuilt their country, walked out of their own caves of memory in classrooms and theaters. They sought to understand why belief in impossible victory had survived so long, and how truth itself could become a weapon of war. In Japan's new universities, professors used the story of Onoda and the leaflets as lessons in communication theory. They spoke of semantic resistance, the refusal to accept information that contradicts identity. In those discussions, the leaflets became metaphors, tiny emblems of the struggle between fact and faith. The phrase, "they laughed at the surrender leaflets," entered public idiom, meaning to ignore reality until it could no longer be denied. Meanwhile, on the islands themselves, nature reclaimed the battlefields. Rusted helmets became planters, tunnels filled with vines. The local children who had once feared the hidden soldiers now played in the same caves, finding scraps of paper that crumbled at a touch. Archaeologists collected them carefully, labeling each piece with dates, coordinates, and the faint traces of kanji still visible beneath mold. The last official U.S. report on Pacific holdouts, Joint Historical Study, 1285, concluded that paper proved more enduring than command. The document's tone was clinical, but between its lines lay the acknowledgement that the war's end had never been a single moment. It had unraveled slowly, through ink and leaflets, through starvation and doubt. By the time of Onoda's death in 2014, nearly 70 years after the war, historians had traced the entire arc, from the first crude printed appeals over Saipan to the final surrender on Morotai. The leaflets that once seemed futile were now studied as early forms of humanitarian outreach. They had promised food, mercy, life. They had failed, yet they had also endured long enough to be proven true. The chronicle closes where it began, with the sound of paper falling through still air. In imagination, one can see them again, the surrender leaflets drifting down over black volcanic rock, settling on caves where young men huddled and whispered that they were lies. Decades later, those same men, or the few who survived, walked out under the sun, bones showing through their skin, clutching those same papers as if they were scripture. They had laughed at them once, but hunger, faith, and the slow erosion of time turned laughter into belief. The war had ended, yet its final act was written not in gunfire, but in the rustle of leaflets landing on an island no map could truly locate, the distance between conviction and truth.